All right, our project today is this Harrington Richardson model 922. It's having a few different problems that we're going to look at. First one is the cylinder isn't rotating consistently, and I think that has to do with a bad lever and spring assembly. The next thing is that the trigger doesn't always reset, and I think there's a couple of different problems there. I think one, it's rubbing on the trigger guard, and two, the spring is a little bit weak, so we're going to replace that as well. And the third problem it's having is it doesn't always stop the cylinder, and that is mainly due to the cylinder stop being worn out on top. If you can see there, that shiny part. So we're going to put some work into it and see what we can do. We're going to be starting off with this Harrington Richardson model 922 diagram. The nice thing about this diagram is that the parts are listed in the order that you would remove them. And then to put it back together, you just reverse the order. All right, so the hard work's already really been done since I've already disassembled this once to know what parts I needed. But we'll go ahead and take it apart fully and get the new parts worked in. So first thing we're going to do is pull out this center pin, and the cylinder was going to drop out. It's also got the extractor in there for extracting the spent casings. So we'll just set that off to the side. I've already removed these two pins. That should come a little bit later on, but I've already done that. So we'll go ahead and pull this trigger guard out. And this little hole right here is where the spring for your cylinder stop goes. So that spring should go in there like that, right at the very end. Okay, but this is the old one, so we're not going to use that. Set that off to the side. All right, one thing to note is that when you pull that trigger guard off, you get this hole right here. Inside the hole, you'll have the detent and the spring, and that's what retains your center pin that holds your cylinder in. So that's what's in there. My detent was stuck in there pretty good. It had lots of old grease and oil and grime on it, holding it in there. So took a little gentle tap and then it came out right away. All right, so now what we're gonna do is take the trigger out, and with the trigger, normally you'd have the sear and the reset spring, as well as the lever and spring assembly attached to it. In order to do that, we're going to need to hit that pin right there. Give it a couple of gentle taps. And it popped right out. Okay, and watch out because there is a spring in this direction right here that resets the trigger, so it may go flying. We'll pull this pin out, put that off to the side. And as you can see, the trigger wants to slide down. Don't force it. You'll end up breaking stuff. As you can see inside here, you've got the spring assembly. And so you don't want to break that. So just gently wiggle it out. It's easier to get back in than it is to take out. All right, so one of the tricks I learned to pulling this out is it gets stuck in there. If you actually pull the hammer back, it loosens up and you can wiggle it out a little bit more. As you see there, pull that spring out. This guy is kind of worn and it's a little hard to see, but that spring is bent. So that should be straight, except for the part where it goes in to the actual trigger. And there is a little hole in there, which I'll show you shortly. See if I can pop this off. Yeah, so it popped out. So that should be straight, except for the bend right there where it fits in the trigger. And if you look right here, you can see that little hole. That's actually where this goes in. And then it connects down here on the pin of that guy. But this is the old one. We're going to get rid of that. We got a new one. All right, so we'll set the trigger off to the side. Next thing to do is take the grips off, and that's just as simple as using a small slotted screwdriver, pulling those off. So there's only one screw on each side, makes it pretty simple. Off here. And back to this side. And the next thing we're going to do is get a paper clip, just a plain paper clip, and open it up a little bit. If you do this, it keeps you from having to try to squeeze the spring back on. So then pull your hammer back, and if you look inside the assembly there, you can actually see that little hole right in there. Drop your paper clip in that hole, release the hammer, and it keeps the tension on that spring so you don't have to fight with it to get it back in. Lean it up, and the whole thing just slides right out. One of the things I've learned is get your paper clip in as close as possible. That way you can clear the holes here. Otherwise you just have to pull your hammer back or just force it up and it'll bend out. Okay, so now that we've got that out, the next thing we're going to do is take this screw out. And this screw holds the hammer in. There is a little pin on the other side. So what I like to do is just get a little punch, keep the gun up a little bit, give it a soft little tap, and that'll pop right out. With that there, now your trigger is loose. Let's put that off to the side. All right, so here are the two parts that we're going to replace today. We've got the cylinder stop assembly, and we've also got the lifter spring assembly. These are both reproduction parts. I purchased them from Numric, gunpartscorp.com. I think all in all they were it was about 25 bucks. They have a number of other parts, so if you've got other parts that you're looking for, they do have lots of parts in stock. All right, so before we try to put this all together inside the gun, I kind of wanted to give an overview of how it should look outside the pistol, because it's a little bit hard to see once you get to working in those areas. So I hope to be able to show you how it all goes together inside, but at least this way you'll be able to see how it goes together outside the gun, and you can visualize how it goes in. So let's start with the trigger first. So the first thing you should do is get the lifter spring, gently insert the spring into the hole. This guy around, line it up here, and you may have to bend in just a little bit to get it to seat. So now it's seated there, and that's what that should look like. Okay, so when you get this in, next thing up is put your spring in here, and that's where the spring will sit. Now, it's easier to get this in and then put the spring in, and this is actually going to hook in right here into that little hole. So that will hook in like that, and then you'll lean it back. And as we go, you'll see me moving the hammer back and forth to make sure that this lines up. Easiest way to get it in is when you're going in, just slide up and it'll click in. So we'll see that here in a second. But then the spring goes in there like that. So we'll set that off to the side for a second. Here on the trigger guard, you get your sear spring and the cylinder stop. So for this one, I'll actually use a punch just so that you can see how it goes in. What I like to do is get the sear, line the sear up like this, and then drop a pin in from the top or the bottom. Bottom will be easier for you to see, but I like doing it from the top. And rotate that sear down. And it should, oh, see, we got, so for the sear, you want to make sure that you don't bend that spring. So what I like to do is line it up. And make sure that the spring is got a little bit of compression on it. Slide a pin through and then rotate this down. Once it's in that position there, it's actually tucked in, as you can see, and that's how you're going to want to insert it. So sometimes I'll get a little piece of tape and just tape that back and leave the pin in there until I'm ready to assemble the entire thing. But in this case, I'll end up taking it apart here in a second. And then your cylinder stop at the very end slides in here, and as I showed you earlier, there's that little hole for the spring, and it sits just like that. And as your all right, so now it's time to reassemble everything. We've already cleaned everything as well as we need to. So first thing we're going to do is put the hammer in. That slides back in there. You can see it line up there in the hole. On the back side, we'll hold that in place. On the back side, sliding around, we'll use the hammer screw stud, put that in. You may have to fidget with it a little bit just to make sure it lines up right. You don't need to hammer this or anything. And one trick I learned is to actually flip it back over before you get it pushed in, and you can see where it lines up and then get it pushed in. So now we got that pushed in. We'll drop the screw in there. Get it started. And as you see there, it actually pushed the stud back out, but it's already started, so now we can just tighten it up. Doesn't need to be too tight. You can always tighten this up later if you need to. But in this case, it does need more tightening because it slid back out. All right. Set there on this side. We're good. We have free movement, so that's good. Next thing we got to put in is the mainspring assembly. And it's going to go in this direction here. Sometimes folks will put it in that way, it won't end up working. So go ahead and make sure you get it in this direction. And what I like to do is just drop it in there, make sure it lines up with the hammer, and then it just kind of falls in. Okay, and again, since we did that trick with the paper clip, it makes our life easier. So go ahead and pull the hammer back again, and it puts pressure on that spring. Let go. And then what I like to do is just make sure that it's seated correctly. We heard it click in right there. So we're all good to go. All right, we can put that paper clip off to the side, and now we can put our grips back on. I like to put the grips back on here because it lifts the gun up a little bit and makes it a little bit easier to work on when you're doing the rest of the work. And just make sure they're lined up. You'll feel them click in. Snug enough. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is put the trigger assembly back together. And the first thing that we'll end up touching is the trigger spring right here. And that actually seats right here inside the frame. There's not a space for it to really go. It's just kind of worn in there. Might have been ground down just a little bit, but not not a huge divot for it to sit in. But then that, of course, goes inside the trigger right there. So inside the gun, that's what it'll end up looking like, well, like we showed earlier. Okay, so this is the tricky part and really the hard part. So this lever and spring assembly right here will be coming out of this slot cut here on the frame. So that you have to make sure lines up. So we'll try it here. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I've got this all assembled like I showed earlier. Let's go ahead and pinch these two together. I like to put my thumb right there on top of the pin, just kind of keep them from flipping apart, and put a little bit of pressure and they'll stay together. And this is going to be the hard part to show. We're going to go ahead and insert this just like that, up in there. Making sure it stays all together. Here I like to take a little screwdriver and just put a little bit of pressure on that. In doing so, you can see it down in there. It's about ready to latch in to the hammer. Pull the hammer back a little bit. We should hear it click. There, you heard it click. Now we'll just line the trigger up so we can get the pin in. All right, so now we'll just push up, line that trigger back up so we can get the pin in. A little bit of pressure in it. Pin started. A couple of little taps. I'm not going to seat that one flush yet until I get towards the end and get everything finished up. That way, in case it's not lined up. All right, now that that's in, we pull the trigger back a little bit. You see the hammer moves, and you can see that the lever and pin spring assembly comes out, and we'll end up pushing the cylinder up. So we assembled everything right. If you don't see those two things, you know it's not assembled right, and go ahead and take it back apart and try it again. All right, now we'll move on to the trigger guard and that assembly. So the first thing I like to do is set the gun like this, drop the detent down in there, pointy end towards the top of the gun, and the spring, drop that in there. And as you can see there, it doesn't quite set flush. That's okay, we'll compress that spring. That's really what gives that detent a little bit of pressure for holding the pin in. All right, so now what we've got to do is get the cylinder stop in. I actually like to install the cylinder stop on its own. And so to do that, lean the gun up like that. I think you can see in there. And this just actually slides, I know my hand's in the way, slides down under the trigger. And if you pull the trigger back just a little bit, it makes it easier to slide in, and it drops in. You'll see it seat like that. So the side of the gun will look like that with the... All right, now that we've got that cylinder stop installed under the trigger, we're gonna have to put everything back together on the trigger guard. And this is kind of the tough part, like I was talking about earlier. Make sure your small pin is up front, and your larger one's in the back. That way it makes it a little bit easier for you to put it together and get those assembled. So what we're gonna do now is put the sear in, like I showed earlier. making sure not to bend it. Okay, so we got that together. We got some pressure on it. So now that we've got this assembled, and you can see it there, it's a little off, but a little bit of pressure on it and it's back to normal. What I like to do is turn the gun just a little bit, make it easier for me to line that spring up in the hole. We got it in, and we'll just slide everything back. And now the holes are lined up. Get one pin in there, tap it just to hold everything together. Okay, so that's holding that in. Now we'll work on the front, and so you got some spring pressure pushing it down, so we'll have to put a little bit of pressure to push it up. Get it lined up, get the pin in, tap it. All right, so we should be all together. Now the last thing we got to do, get the cylinder, drop the cylinder in there, and the retaining pin. We are all good to go. Nice and tight lockup. Way better than it was earlier. Earlier this was just spinning. So that was how to reassemble an H&R Model 922. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to answer. I'll also leave a link in the description below of the parts diagram I used. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more random videos. Have a great day.